silent mourning and sackcloth and ashes. Job speaks for the first time in Job 3. His friends are there to listen, and after he opens the doors, they, starting here in chapter 4, are going to walk right in and tell him what for, how wrong he is. And that's where we begin tonight. So I'll just start with this question. It depends some on homework being done, but we will highlight some verses regardless. But I do just want to get right into it and start. Overall, in these first two chapters of Eliphaz's kind of first speeches in chapters 4 and 5, how would you summarize kind of the main 2 or 3 ideas that Eliphaz says in his speech? What ideas does what's kind of his point? What's the arguments that he makes? He's debating Job, it seems, to some extent, or really accusing Job. And what are his arguments based off of for Job?
Is not the fear, the confidence they had in God. Has anything changed?
Yeah. So he's one of the points he makes is what's like kind of looking at the change, right, and saying something must. If this is the change in like your relationship, then there must be a change in maybe character or in attitude. Is that what you're kind of pointing to with that?
Starts out telling him everything that he's done right, and now all of a sudden it's come back to you, the problems that you've been helping other people. So I don't know going back to Job's response he opened the door to a lot of questions himself.
Yeah.
And I think they just jumped on with all those questions.
Sure. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it is interesting. He starts with these kind of all the things he's done for these people who are in situations like him now, and like he is in now, but now his confidence is gone. It's almost like one of Eliphaz's first points is belittling everything he's going through, saying tons of people have gone through stuff just like this, and you're okay with it when they suffered it, but now you're suffering it and your confidence is shaking, which is a pretty brutal way to start all of this, to say to someone who's going through all this. Good. Kathy?
Well, he's kind of accusing him of not being upright, because in verse 7 and 8, he says, remember now, whoever perished from being innocent. Yeah. So isn't he accusing him of not being innocent?
Yeah, there's implication, right? He with the questions he asks, he begs the implication that he says, he's, at least at this point, I don't know if careful is the right word, but he is defensive enough in his speech to not come out and say it, but it is certainly there in his words, right? That there is an accusation, there's an edge of accusation underneath this. Whoever perished being innocent, where were the upright destroyed? You show me that case, and I'll look at you differently, is kind of what he's saying. Good. Rick?
I think that his friends are just like him. He makes statements that, from man's point of view, from observing what's going on, and their answers and their questions are silly.
Yeah.
At best.
Yeah.
This
is the interesting thing with working through these things is, you're right, like their answers are so manly in the sense of just like, not even like masculine manly, but just humanly. Like they're these answers given from this perspective, I know what's right, I know what's wrong, and I can see it clearly in your life now, and I can judge it pretty accurately. And they will be proven to be silly. What's interesting as we wrestle through them is we know that they're wrong from the jump, because we can constantly compare it to God's judgment of Job, right? We know because of the prologue, we know behind the curtain. And yet I think there is some wrestling to do with their arguments, or at least comparing and contrasting with our honest assessment of the world around us as well, which is kind of the beauty and the difficulty of this whole book, is that we have to read all these arguments we know are wrong. But I think the business of Job, if we're good Bible students or honest, if we can be honest with ourselves, which isn't always easy, is to really ask ourselves, have I ever, or do I ever, engage in judgment or in assessing the world around me like these guys do? Because the truth of the matter is, probably more often than we like to admit, we read this in a Bible in a room like this together, and we're like, okay, well, these guys are wrong. Clearly, that's not me. But the honest truth is that probably more often than we like to admit, we are probably more like his 3 friends than we are like Job. in how we judge the world, how we look around at people, who we decide to give to or help out. We make these judgments. Well, clearly we can make all these assessments of the world around us. Anyway, all that to say, not that it makes them any less wrong, it just is a really, I think, important point to judge them on an equal plane with ourselves to some extent as we interact with this. Good. Anything else about these two chapters and the points that Eliphaz makes in his speech to Job that you guys noticed as you read it? Mark?
Well, the implication, one of the big implications of Eliphaz's speech is the fact that Job was suffering was the proof. Mm-hmm. That's the proof that he was just guilty of sin.
Yes. And spoiler alert, that's going to be the only point they have to go off of. In the whole book of Job, his three friends, the only point they can really make any hay about is the fact that they are arguing backwards from the evidence they have. Well, you've suffered all this, you must have sinned. And all their arguments are fanciful wordings of that, which is crazy that they feel like they haven't stated it enough. But as we see tonight with the three friends in their first rounds, and then next week, and the week after that, we're going to see that their speeches they multiply words making that same point over and over again. That's good. Here's a few verses I kind of picked out. Not that they're, there's a lot of verses in here, but 4:7, remember now whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? I think this one verse does a good job of articulating a lot of Eliphaz's kind of idea. Hey, don't forget, Job, you pointed this out, Kathy, don't forget, no innocent person ever perished. It's pretty brutal. Like a lot of these things are really, really brutal. We'll look at this a little more in depth with the next question. But in the middle of this, he raises this question: can mankind be just before God? Can a man be pure before his maker? This is like a very it's a philosophical question. It's a theological question, in fact. And it's an interesting one that people still we talk about with our different views of how God works and who he is. Mike?
Can man be more just than God? Kind of a twist on, can mankind be just before God, but more just than God?
Yeah. Interesting.
It throws the example, who's judging?
Yeah.
Is it man judging without all the information, where maybe God should be doing the judging? It's one of them 17 that's hard for me to figure out exactly why that got put in there. And one or two words difference makes it totally different.
You're right. Yeah. Yeah, those are very different meanings of that. But I think the central kind of heart of it remains the same, that he's leveling, he's kind of leveling Job's case and saying, listen, you're acting as if you've done no wrong. Can you be just before God, or are you putting yourself above God? Because in his mind, he's assumed that God has judged him as worthy of this. And if Job says he's not, then so I don't know. I'm just, as I wrestle with that, but I'll look into that and see the translation of that. It's interesting. One more verse from Eliphaz's first speech. He says, but as for me, I would seek God. Again, think about the implication of this. Job, in the depths of his suffering, Eliphaz is like, hey, have you tried seeking God? Is that important to you at all? His friends are going to say this. Maybe I shouldn't read it so unfairly, but there is a difficult, there's a hardship in this to some extent. He says, as for me, I would seek God, and I would place my cause before God, who does great and unsearchable things, wonders without number. He's right? It's like this is what we're saying. Maybe there are times where we've said stuff like this to somebody who is at a dark, low point in their life, and we're like, hey, you need to seek God. And you're like, that's right, Christian, that's true. And yet, you read this in the context of the situation, you're like, there's something that rings hollow about it. And so it's interesting. For me, these are kind of three big, or high points is the wrong word for it, but three to me, these summarize to some extent the gist of Eliphaz's speeches to Job. Anything else about Eliphaz's first speech that you guys noticed as you read through it? Anything stick out to y'all? Rick?
Every time I read this, Job, and I think about what they're saying, I understand that, one, when we read it, we see that Satan is behind the whole thing, behind Job's suffering. Mm-hmm. And again, we got to always keep in mind the human statements that they are making from where they are And as we read it, yeah, we see the outcome. We know what the, you know, and we're getting we know the end result. Mm-hmm. But so oftentimes when we're in situations or we're dealing with people or family members going through this, that, and the other, there's a time when we misjudge and we misfire with our speech, with our thinking. In a moment's time, we can say something and go, "Oh snap! I shouldn't have said that."
Yeah.
You know, and that, but that's the humanity of it all.
Yeah.
And we look at these guys and go, "Ooh, man, I don't know if I'd have told them that." Well, yeah, you would have.
Yeah.
You know, we try to put ourselves in a different spotlight, and then I've heard preachers say, evangelists, you're represented in every statement that somewhere in the Bible when you say, "Oh, those people shouldn't have done." Well, you was there too. Mm-hmm. You know, your attitude. You don't try to think you're better than what they're saying.
Yeah.
You know, and we try to elevate ourselves because we see, why did they do it? Well, you know, just like them, they didn't have all the. Yeah. You know, they're just making statements from what they see. Man.
Yeah, I think looking at this and seeing the humanity of it is the reason it was written the way it was. Because we could have had the summary, we could have had the cliff notes of this very easily. Job's right, his friends are wrong. Here's some of the high points of what they said. But the point of this is that there is a human experience to suffering and to wrestling with this great question behind suffering, which isn't the suffering itself even, but so much as what does it mean about God that I've suffered this way? And the only way to answer that question is a human way. You can't answer that intellectually with a PhD. You can't answer that any other way. And so what Job, I think the beauty of Job and its poetry is it subjects us, even if we haven't suffered like this, it subjects us to the human kind of wrestling with this, with three men who are very wise, and Job, who is even wiser than them, right? Elihu as well. So 5 guys total who are all some of the wisest men ever, right? That's how we are meant to see them. And most of them are wrong. And I think that's part of the point, is that most people's views of suffering and pain and evil in the world, most human, even the wisest people, don't get it. And so the only thing that can be said for it is to go through it and wrestle through it and maintain your relationship with God. And one of the big points of Job is going to be, you don't have to understand it all. But if our relationship with God will make sense of it, like that song we sing Farther Along, right? We'll understand it all by and by. That's the hope we have. So let's keep moving on. There's so much to say here. Eliphaz in his speech does this really interesting moment. Did you see what kind of experience Eliphaz shared with Job in chapter 4, verses 12 through 21? I want to compare this information he received with what we know of God from the prologue. But look here, I'll put it up on the board. Job 4 and verse 12, he says, "Now a word was brought to me stealthily, and my ear received a whisper of it, amid disquieting thoughts from the visions of the night, when deep sleep falls on men." That's just beautiful poetry, all right? No matter what you think about Job or Eliphaz here, this is, I think, just beautiful. Even in English, it's beautiful poetry. 14, "Dread came upon me, and trembling, and made all my bones shake. Then a spirit passed by my face. The hair of my flesh bristled up. It stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes. There was silence. Then I heard a voice. Can mankind be just before God? Can a man be pure before his maker? He puts no trust even in his servants, and against his angels he charges error. How much more those who dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed before the moth? Between morning and evening they are broken in pieces. Unobserved they perish forever. Is not their tent cord plucked up within them? They die, yet without wisdom." What is Eliphaz? What kind of source is Eliphaz getting his information from here? Do you see it? He says, "A word was brought to me." Yeah, he says a spirit, right? In verse 15, "A spirit passed by my face." He said, "I had this dream. I had a dream, Job, and in my dream the Spirit came to me and spoke to me, and I understood it." And what did the Spirit say to him? Can mankind be just before God? Can a man be pure before his maker? And even further, he puts no trust even in his servants, and against his angels he charges error. This Spirit that spoke to Eliphaz, I'm just going to take Eliphaz at his word that this actually happened to him, and he had this Spirit come and speak this to him. How does it compare with God himself? Did God say stuff like this in the prologue? What did God say about Job in the very first verses of this book?
He has integrity.
He has integrity, he's upright, he even calls him blameless. Well, apparently this spirit told Eliphaz that man can't ask, the implication is no. This is a rhetorical question. No, they can't. They can't be pure before his maker. And in verse 18, it makes it clear, he puts no trust in his servants. Is that what happened to Job? God has no trust in you, Job. That's why you're suffering through all this. The Spirit told me, I had this dream, and in the dream, the Spirit told me that the reason you're suffering is because God has no trust in you. And you can't be pure, and you aren't right, and he has no trust in you, so that's why you're suffering. What spirit do you think this was?
Demonic, personally. You look at the statement that he made and how he made it, right? Mm-hmm. God didn't send it to that dream. It's evident that Satan is behind it. Yeah. One, to say, oh, there's no way you can live just like in the garden. Go ahead and eat that. It's okay. Mm-hmm. It's going to be all right. That food. Yeah. Go ahead. He's always trying to change the way we think about God. Yeah. He's always trying to, and I had some weird dreams when Hilda passed away. It was like, hope up, and I wake up and go, man, I'm glad that ain't real. Yeah. That ain't from God. Yes. And you sit on the edge of the bed and you bawl like, the tears start flowing and you get all these emotions. And you got to realize that the adversary, he's not a nice guy. Yeah. Yeah, and so I agree with you. Like, if this dream actually happened, if we're supposed to take Eliphaz at his word, then this spirit that passed before him certainly wasn't from God, right? Which I wanted to point this out and say how interesting it was that Eliphaz, for his credibility, he puts his credibility in line with this dream he had, which there are times in the Bible where dreams are from God and they mean something, right? I'm not saying that all this now we should go and search through all our dreams, but there were times where this was something that was looked to. And Eliphaz had a dream that he trusted in, and it was wrong. And I just think it's interesting to point that out, to see this, and to see that there's stuff like in 1 John 4, verses we don't know what to do with, where it says, test the spirits, And there is things where we have to compare it to what we know of God and what we know to be true, and do it with humility and with care and concern and discernment. Anyway, I just think this is really interesting, and I think it's fascinating that he makes the exact opposite point that we see God make in the prologue. And so clearly the spirit or this dream, if he had it, wasn't true. And I just think that's a really fascinating kind of insight into this poetry. Anything else about this kind of dream section of Eliphaz's speech? Go ahead, and we'll move on.
Well, maybe because with his dream and their understanding at the time, that maybe it made sense to him to accept the dream versus deciding to accept, the fact that Job was upright and that his integrity was good. And now all this befell him. The dream must have meant something, proving to him that he wasn't upright and he wasn't innocent of not sinning. And so maybe he felt that this is what should have happened to Job.
Yeah. Yeah, here's one of the reasons this interesting to point out. To your point, if we give Eliphaz some credit, if this dream happened, it would be a pretty difficult thing to discern, right? A spirit came and told him, this is what you should think about Job, or this is what's going on. And if that's the case, there's a pretty difficult thing to discern. You might want to put some trust in that just because of the experience itself. And here's one of the reasons I point this out, just to put it into modern kind of terms and vernacular. There are all sorts of spiritual, religious forces that impose upon our discernment like this. Certainly lots of cults will use stuff like this, where they'll impose an experience, maybe an emotional experience, maybe a physiological response to hearing or reading or praying. And there's all sorts of things that we're supposed to look to, and those things may actually occur to you in the process of going through whatever it is. I'm being very vague because I don't want to call out any specifics, right? I don't want to get in that business. Here's the point. This happened to Eliphaz, apparently, and it was wrong. And he had to discern it, and through his discernment, he was wrong. So sometimes the stuff we put stock into, like you were pointing out, Ricky, the dreams or the emotional experiences, or even these kind of like spiritual, I'll put in air quotes, experiences, we still have to discern them. They're not just 100% true. And in this world, as we see in Job, there isn't just, God's not the only spiritual force in the world that is acting and has influence upon us. That's a big thing to say, I suppose, but I don't mean to cast any fear. I just mean like when we make decisions and we judge the world around us, we have to always be leaning and trusting humbly upon God and His will, and Jesus Christ and His Holy Spirit, and through that, that'll be the guiding direction through all that. What a big topic to bring up in this class. Maybe it was. But anyway, I think it's really, really interesting to see us with Eliphaz. All right, let's move on. Bildad, in his speech in chapter 8, has a few other points to make. Did you guys see any big ideas or main points from what Bildad said in his speech in chapter 8 that was worth pointing out? How would you summarize some of his big ideas? Here's one of the ones that I thought was, I think, one of his main points. Verse 3, does God pervert justice? Or does the Almighty pervert what is right? If your sons sinned against Him, then He delivered them into the power of their transgression. What do you think about that? I mean, there's so many things that he said, right? Like, we forget maybe sometimes that Job isn't the only one suffering here, who has suffered or dealt with the brunt of these things, right? That his children died through all of this. And in his first speech, some of his first words, Bildad points to the death of his children and says, have you considered the fact that maybe they were just sinners? And that's why your children died? And these are like some of the first words out of his mouth. That's pretty, again, I keep using this word brutal, but there's no other word that comes to my mind. This is like, I can't even comprehend the significance of the pain this would bring, like pile on to a question Job may have already had. We already know that. Why did Job offer sacrifices every week? You remember? Just in case they might have sinned. So of course Job thought, yeah, I know they might. And now Bildad says, well, now we know, Job. That's why. They died because they sinned. And so again, Bildad piles on, right? Again, in verse 20, he says, lo, God will not reject a man of integrity, nor will He support the evildoers. Do you see a similar point as to Eliphaz's speeches, right? It's the same kind of message from a different voice, spoken a little differently, and using different kind of evidence, but it's all the same evidence. Because of what's happened, clearly you're wrong, and maybe even your children were wrong, so it's right that they died. God did justice to them. Because He will never reject a man of integrity, nor will He support evildoers. I mean, this is just... I'm repeating myself, but it's just to see the same point over and over and over again, driven through, it's painful. And so as in Job's response, he says he has a lot to say to Bildad, to all of his friends. He responds to each one of these speeches. But did you guys notice any of the kind of ideas what Job says in his responses here in chapters 9 and 10? I want to look specifically in a second at verses 21 to 24. But did you see anything else in these chapters 9 and 10 of Job's response to Bildad that was worth pointing out?
Verse 2 says, truly I know it is so, but how can a man be righteous before God? Mm-hmm. He knows Job, man can be upside down, man.
Yeah.
You know, and my children could be upside down, but that doesn't necessarily cause me to sin against God because of, what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
And that's where it lies. The human again, the human side of these guys. They're trying to answer the best way they observe the situation.
Yeah, yeah.
And just because they observe it doesn't mean they're right when they start blabbing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. They're wrong. In fact,
they're and even Job is, and God will have, and not to jump ahead, mm-hmm. but we got to keep that in mind. That look, just because a bad thing happened doesn't mean God had made it happen.
Yeah.
For me that's the first thing I have to remember.
Yeah.
Because the adversary he's ready to destroy you, mm-hmm. children, babies, and having been a foster parent, I know that is a fact. That Satan is destroying children and families and things, and he don't give nothing about nobody. And when I read Job, it's like I'm reminded that we speak out and we say things and like, oh man, maybe I shouldn't have said it like that.
Yeah.
Oh man, maybe I shouldn't have thought that.
Yeah.
And it's a constant battle.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it is like this, seeing the wisdom of man's best attempt to be wise in the face of something that is totally inexplicable. Is I think, again, this is what we're seeing throughout this. Look here at verses 21 to 24. Job reaches this conclusion at this point in his response to his friend. He says, I'm guiltless. I do not take notice of myself. I despise my life. It is all one. Therefore, I say, he destroys the guiltless and the wicked. If the scourge kills suddenly, he mocks the despair of the innocent. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covers the faces of its judges. If it is not he, then who is it? What do you see here in Job's conclusion at this point? What's he saying? What are some of the assertions he's making in this conclusion?
I didn't do anything, and I know I didn't do anything.
Yeah. So first of all, he says, "I'm guiltless," right?
Yeah.
I didn't do the wrong to deserve this. What else does he say? Especially in the last verse. What's the kind of the driving force that he drives to at this conclusion?
It's not God, who is it?
Yeah. If it's not God, then who is it? Right? This is. Then again, like this is rhetorical poetry. He's saying, God's behind this, and he's looking to him, right? And so again, like Job will kind of hedge around this point and continue to. People look at all of his speeches and they say they gain in both rhetorical and poetic force as they go on. As Job goes more and more, his point gets sharper and sharper and more well put. But here, very early on, we start to see him make this point that God is behind this. And I think that there is some wrestling that has to be done with this, even for ourselves, as we see he's wrong, but he's not totally wrong. Just like his friends are wrong in their assertion about him specifically, but they're not totally wrong in the grand scheme, because God does, he doesn't uphold the unrighteous. And so these are the things we have to wrestle with through this. There's also another interesting thing that I think is worth pointing out in Job's response. If you have your Bibles, look at Job 9 and verse 32. A little farther after this, as Job is continuing to talk about his pains before God and his case, in Job 9:32 he says, of God, he is not a man as I am, that I may answer him, that we may go to court together. There is no umpire between us who may lay his hand upon us both. It's amazing the things that Job speaks to that he has no idea of. Do these verses make you think of anything in the pages of the Bible? Some umpire that could lay his hand both on God and on man and plead Job's case for him to God himself? Yeah. I love this. Like before, he didn't have the book of Hebrews where we're saying we can have these things spelled out for us. Or he's like, yeah, I love this about Jesus. Job longed for this in the days before Christ. He longed for something, somebody, some force, some person that could be like Jesus Christ. It's amazing, a heart like this. It's just to have someone come to this conclusion without knowing it. It speaks even more to the beauty of faith than for those of us who can even look back on it knowing what it is concretely. So I just want to point that out. But yeah, so he has these conclusions, and he has this question: if it's not God, then who is it? And to some extent, we have to see there is a correct assertion that God is behind. His unseen hand is in it all, right? God's hand is behind everything. But this ascription of blame, or the fact that the force behind this is that God is opposed to him, Job's wrong about. And this is what's confusing about this, right? That Job suffered all these things, and God's allowed it, and God's hand is involved in it, therefore, whether directly or indirectly. Satan's obviously the one who's pushing this. But God allows it to happen, and so Job's wrestling with this fact that God has allowed this, and then how can I not blame him if I'm righteous? And this is, I think, again, we're reasoning and wrestling through people's judgment of facts and of experiences. But Job is wrestling through, I think, not thinking or trying to understand God's mind. And it's difficult, I know it's difficult to go through profoundly painful suffering and to comprehend how God could be for you through that. And that's what Job's questioning. God's behind everything. How can he be for me through this? He doesn't seem to be. And certainly no one thinks God is for Job through this. All right, let's keep moving on, keep pushing along. So the final speech from his three friends in this first round of debates is from Zophar. As you read through Zophar's speech in chapter 11, what were some of his main points? Like, what was the thrust of his speech in Job chapter 11? Go ahead, Mark.
Job, you're full of words. All you've got is a bunch of talk.
Yeah.
Should your boasting make us be quiet and just go home?
Yeah. Yes, you're right. It's one of the first things he says, just, hey, should we just listen to you? I guess we'll take your word for it. It's an ironic thing to say, too, at this point, right? After the other two friends have said a lot. But I think they're all they're problem solvers, right? These guys are all problem solvers. Good. What else do we see Zophar say in his speech? Here's something I wanted to point out. Just as he starts, from the very beginning, he kind of just gets right to it. This is what you pointed out, Mark. Shall a multitude of words go unanswered, and a talkative man be acquitted? Can you talk your way out of this, Job? That's kind of what you're saying. Can you talk your way out of this? Shall your boasts silence men, and shall you scoff and none rebuke? For you have said, my teaching is pure, and I am innocent in your eyes. But would that God might speak, and open his lips against you, and show you the secrets of wisdom, for sound wisdom has two sides. Know then that God forgets a part of your iniquity. A lot of interesting things in here, but I think one of again, like the other two friends, in verse 4 and 5, you can see what Zophar thinks. You're saying your teaching's pure, but I wish that God could tell you how wrong you are. I wish that God himself could speak to you. Apparently we can't convince you, but maybe if God spoke to you, he could make you realize how wrong you actually are. It's funny reading, like you said, Ricky, like looking ahead, like it's funny reading these things now and seeing that God's going to speak, right? Remember that God's going to speak. It's going to be a little different than Zophar thinks it would go. But as we think about all of these three friends and their speeches, what do they have in common? What are the three friends and their speeches and the points they make? I know we just kind of summarized them briefly, but as you read them, as you thought about them, what was just kind of like the main thrust of all the three friends' ideas and speeches? Go ahead, Lance.
Well, I just got these thoughts every time I read the book of Job, and his three friends, how they assess that he must have sinned. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to always put myself, if I was in their position at that time, and that up till then, it just seems like God punished those who were sinful and blessed his people who were gathering towards him. Mm-hmm. So it's great we have hindsight. We can read it now and say, well, you were wrong. You should have put your faith in God. But it just seems like, did they know that God's throwing kind of like a curveball this time? That he's allowing Satan to kind of test and punish Job in some way. And so I kind of guess, we know they were incorrect in their assertions, mm-hmm. but are we too harsh on them? I don't know. I'm just looking to see what people think.
Yeah, that's a great question. To this, right, like, I think that's kind of what I was trying to ask with this question. How are they right in their wrong assertions? Because certainly their conclusions are wrong, right? We can all say, yeah, of course, that's what Job is, the point the book is making. But how are they right even in their wrongness? I think it's really interesting to kind of try and work through that and parse through it, because their arguments have some kind of weight to them, right? And so I think sometimes as we kind of weigh them out, Job says in one of his first responses, I wish my sorrows could be weighed. But as we weigh like their arguments, what elements of truth or rightness come out? Terry?
I think they have a desire to please God.
Yeah.
And they know that God is powerful and righteous. And so they're going from that point of view.
Yeah.
They don't have the other part of the understanding, but they're going from that point of view.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good thing for us to reflect on. Sometimes we have what we are very sure is truth, and we may be off.
Yeah.
And we only can judge ourselves.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So I think you are right. Like some of the strength of it is that they have this very pure view of God's righteousness and holiness and power, and so they believe that. Like they are whole hog in on that. And so that's one of the right things about the wrongness. I like what you said. We have to be more careful about our judgment. Kathy?
What was their understanding of Satan?
That's a great question. I don't think we really...
Did they not know about Satan? Because it's never brought up. Well, could this be from God or could it be from Satan?
Yeah.
I mean, why is that never questioned?
Yeah. That's a great question. It starts to get into the question of when this book was written and such. A lot of people put Job living in the similar time as Abraham, maybe, in this time of the patriarchs, which is very early and means that there might not have been, Moses wrote, if we believe it, Moses wrote Genesis through Deuteronomy, so so the events in the garden that happened with Adam and Eve and the devil, maybe those stories were passed down, but they didn't have they likely, if Job was written in that time, he didn't have the book of Genesis to look to. So all I say that to say is I multiplied a bunch of words to say, I don't know. I don't think we can know what understanding they had. They certainly don't seem to bring up the idea of Satan, which I think if... It
seems like if they knew about him, that would come up at some point.
Yeah. No, I agree. He certainly is the main character as we read the book very early on, right? And so we can't help but constantly be thinking come on, guys, you know who's behind this? We know who's behind it. You're kind of it's like you're yelling at your TV for the people to not go in the room. They're going to go in. It's don't make the mistake. You're making the mistake I didn't want you to make. Good. How else are they right, maybe, in their wrong assertions? Well, actually, we should probably move on. I didn't realize what time it was. Yeah, I think you guys are right. It's interesting. They're just they miss the big picture. They miss kind of the overall truth. Again, I'll highlight some of their words together. Whoever perished being innocent, if you are pure and upright, surely he would rouse himself for you and restore your righteous estate. These are one line from each of their speeches. If iniquity is in your hand, put it far away and do not let wickedness dwell in your tents. Then indeed you could lift up your face without moral defect, and you would be steadfast and not fear. All the implication, you've done wrong. And if you turn like this is actually a true thing in general, right? These words, if iniquity is in your hand, put it far away, and do not let wickedness dwell in your tents. What a great encouragement to somebody, right? Not to Job in this moment, but in general, it's true. And indeed, then you could lift up your face without moral defect. This is something John the Baptist preached this message, for crying out loud. Hey, the axe is at the root of the tree. You better repent. The kingdom of heaven is near. Very similar message. But that's not Job's problem, is it? So that's what I'm trying to point out, is that these guys, they understood righteousness. They understood the moral responsibility that we have to be righteous. But that wasn't the problem in this case, which is just the fascinating kind of challenge in the middle of all this. So as Job goes through this, I want to skip this question because we don't have time to look at it. It's really important to see this. Job's going to look at death and see death as this relief. And he makes this counterpoint in chapter 12 about just all of how God's ways are above and how God's in control of everything. But as we finish up, I just want to ask this question. Why do you think Job's friends spoke in these ways? And what do their mistakes teach us about suffering, teach us about comforting, and teach us about wisdom? Mike?
The misconception of God always putting a hedge around his people. I mean, there is a reason for suffering. There is a growth that comes from it. Whether or not you can see the lining in the gray cloud or not, there's something good that's there. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the world says, why would God let anyone suffer? Mm-hmm. But there's a lesson there that you can't get anywhere else. Yeah. Which again, that adds another wrinkle to this, because it's not like that's the greatest thing to say to somebody who's suffering either. Like, hey, there's a lesson in this for you, But you're right, if we have that awareness, then we won't make a lot of mistakes they made. Be like, well, you must have really messed up. That's why you're only adding to it. But again, that's a really good point to bring up. What else? What else do we learn from them, or why do you think they spoke in these ways? I mean, they seem like pretty lousy friends. Hey, your kids were sinners. That's why they died, Job. Does that comfort you right now? Is that helpful to you to say? I mean, these guys really had no seemingly heart for sympathy or empathy, but they thought it was important to speak this way, right? Mike? I still look at his wife, curse God and die. I mean, nobody says that to him. It's like correct whatever's wrong. So, I mean, there's that string of something right in their messages with what little information they truly have to deal with.
Yeah, I think the only thing I can come to is that they genuinely believed he was a sinner, right? These wise people who tried their best to seemingly try to live their lives in the most righteous way, they were friends of Job because they seemed to have similar interests and similar views of God. They were genuinely concerned that Job was a scoffer, someone who wasn't just sinful, but who was sinning to God and preaching that he was right. I mean, just a hypocrite, all the worst things we could say about someone who's religious, that's what they believed. And it's fascinating to kind of lay that over some of our ways that we talk to people that we might disagree with theologically or in faith or religious kind of situations. And to say they must have been right to some degree to say something, maybe, but they were wrong in this. And the whole other level to this about, and you pointed this out earlier, Terry, that we have to be real careful when we enter into situations. The more severe the situation, maybe the more careful we have to be. But we have to be real careful that we don't put ourselves in the place of judge or ruler or creator, who knows everything. And so it's okay to say to someone who says, why am I going through all this? Say, I don't know. I don't know. It sure is painful though, isn't it? I'm here for you, They did that for a while. These guys sat in silence with him for a long time. And maybe they should have just continued on sitting in silence with him, right? But I think as we start to learn from their mistakes about suffering and comforting and wisdom, the funny thing is, even if they knew the right answer, like you pointed out, Mike, if they had known that there's a silver lining, there's something God's doing something that's suffering, even knowing that can sometimes make us make a mistake where we'll say it then, And that doesn't always help either. And so there's so much to be appreciated and learned about not just pain on the cosmic sense, but on the very human way we experience it. This story tells us and teaches us just layers upon layers of how suffering really affects the human soul and how we can make it worse. It's way easier to make it worse for somebody than it is to make it better. And so to me, this teaches a lot of caution in reaching judgments and asserting those judgments to people especially. Anyway, lots to say there. There's questions up here for next week. It's less text to cover next week, so that'll do us a favor. I really appreciate all your comments and your wisdom.